Thank you for this presentation. And as he said, my name is Eliezer Papo. I'm originally from Sarajevo, where you are going next weekend or something like that. And my first lecture today will deal with that city and its Jewish community. So, which you can see here, I suppose most of you read Hebrew, right? So it's Sarajevo, Yerushalayim, Haketana, or in Rashi letters below, Sarai El Chico Yerushalayim. Small Jerusalem. That's the way the Jews used to call it, because it was one of the important centers of Jewish learning. Now, I have a question for you guys. How do you know whether a certain Jewish community is important or not? Yes?
Well, possibly by its size, or by the influence that it had on the Jewish tradition. So Talmudic scholars or not Talmudic, but later works came out that significantly influenced the Jewish community.
So I'm offering us two different options. One is quantity guarantees quality, and that one we will rule out. There were huge communities which didn't provide anything. And then, yes, the influence on the Jewish life. So basically the indicator would be, if the community imports rabbis, it's not important. If it exports rabbis, it's important, and it influences other communities. So Sarajevo, during the first 200 years of its existence, I mean the Jewish community of Sarajevo was not extremely important. It was rather a satellite of the Jewish community of Salonika. But then later, with the time, a yeshiva was established there, and then Sarajevo started exporting rabbis to the neighboring communities, becoming one of the most important Sephardic cultural and legal rabbinical centers in the Balkans. Now, I will speak with you, well, today you will see, when you visit Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's basically a confederation of two different parts. So you have the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and you have Republic of Srpska. Together, they compose Confederation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, Sarajevo prides itself in at least three brands. So one brand would be even world wars, right? You know, the first, the third, and so on. So yeah, the joke in Sarajevo is that all even world wars start there. This is actually the place that you will see once you get to Sarajevo. This is the place from where the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated on 28th of June 1914, and that actually was the final drop in the cup of preparation for the major war between Germany on one side, England, French, Russia, and everybody else on the other. The second brand that Sarajevo is famous for, or prides itself in, is the Sarajevo Haggadah. Have you ever heard of the Haggadah of Sarajevo, or the Sarajevo Haggadah? By the way, you don't really need to write down anything, because anybody who needs, I will be passing to Jay entire this PowerPoint presentation, so you will all get it. If there is something that I'm saying that's not in the presentation, you can you take a note if you want to. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But slides and that kind of stuff you don't need to copy, because you will all get the entire PowerPoint presentation. So, have anybody heard of the Sarajevo Haggadah? Yes. Again, you. What did you hear?
Well, then it's a famous Haggadah that has a lot of pictures in it, and that it was smuggled out of Sarajevo. And then I think it was maybe not from Sarajevo originally, but it was brought there, and then it was there for a couple hundred years, and then during the war it was saved.
Yes. So there is a writer in America called Geraldine Brooks, and she wrote recently a book called People of the Book. And it tells the story of the Sarajevo Haggadah, but it's too good to be true the way she's telling it. She made it kind of, between operetta and CNN, so it's not the real story. The real story is the Sarajevo Haggadah was produced in 14th century Spain, in Catalonia, most probably in Barcelona, 13th to 14th century Spain. It was brought to Sarajevo together with the expulsees, which left Spain when? 1492. The first generation of the expulsees didn't reach Sarajevo immediately, and we will speak about that during our second lecture. The dispersion of Jews of Spain and the creation and formation of virtual Sepharad. So why the Sarajevo Haggadah is so famous? because it's one of the first, basically it's the first known Sephardic Haggadah that contains paintings which include depictions of humans. In other words, being the fact that Spain, if you remember, sometime it was under Muslim rule, and sometime it was under Christian rule, and most of the time it was different parts were changing hands, right? So during the Muslim rule of Spain, the Sephardic Jews who lived in Spain, together with their Muslim neighbors, had very strict interpretation of what's the meaning of the second divine commandment, the one concerning images. So basically, just like in Islamic art, in Sephardic art during the Islamic rule of Spain, you wouldn't find Jewish manuscripts illustrated with human bodies. It was unimaginable, right? Because it was very, very restrictive interpretation of you should not make any image of any dead, you know. So you can see how the depictions look like, and you can see here the representation of the creation of the world, right? With the seventh day, the day of the rest. And you can see depiction of human body. You can see a Jew taking rest on Shabbat. Now I want to show you some other things which are interesting in the Sarajevo Haggadah before we get to the history of the city and the Jewish community in it. Can anybody recognize what do we have here? Yes?
Is that the dreams of Joseph?
No, that's dreams of Paro, yeah, Paro, and what he is dreaming. Yes, so we have 7 huge cows, and those huge cows will swallow those teeny cows, right? But what do you see on his head? Crown. Oh, isn't that interesting? Doesn't that look like a Christian crown? Like a crown of a Christian king? Would you imagine today Paro wearing such a crown? No. So, what we see over here is something that we call anachronism. Anachronism means ascribing to previous times something that's normal for your own time. Now,
you to write it down. I'm going to get you a pen.
Yeah, okay. So Jewish artist in 13th, 14th century Spain, the only thing he knew about Egyptian king was that he was a Gentile king. Now everybody knows how a Gentile king looks like, right? Something like that. So he painted the Egyptian Gentile king the same way the Spanish king looked like. And this is the way he would imagine throwing Joseph to prison. So you can see, here is the wife of Potiphar, right? Taking Joseph's garment from him. And here is what they imagined to be an Egyptian soldier taking Joseph to an Egyptian prison. Yeah. Well, and this is, yes. So, anachronism. Okay, so you can see that the soldier looks totally like medieval Spanish soldier. Now I want to show you, okay, so here you can see again the soldiers bringing the brothers back to Joseph's palace and finding the rail or the gabia in one of the, okay. And here this is like the very nice part, because we see the later additions. But first, let's define this. You can see that in the house of the Jews there was light, and in the house of Pharaoh himself and the rest of the Egyptians there was what? Choshech, right? You remember, darkness, right? Again, we see that the Egyptian king is imagined as having a Christian crown and having a scepter of a Christian king. And then below, you can see the Paro coming home, only to discover that his own firstborn died. And here we see Makat Bechorot, the death of the firstborns. Yes?
You said this is the Haggadah, yeah?
Yes.
So why does it include the story of Joseph
it tells the entire story of how God created the world and how Abraham was ready to, and how there was a flood and Abraham was ready to sacrifice Isaac, and then Joseph, and then they were brought down to Egypt, and then God takes them miraculously out of Egypt. So it tells basically the entire first and second book of Moses, the entire Genesis. The pictures in the Haggadah of Sarajevo depict the first and the second book of Torah, Genesis and Shemot or Exodus. Now, here I want you to concentrate on this. Do you see anything that you might want to describe as later?
Maybe it's like referencing the Black Death. Is that what the blackness is coming out of their mouth?
You are referring to this one?
No, it says, yeah, for this, in terms of the death of these
Yeah.
firstborn, there's like a black smoke coming out of their mouth. Is that what?
Well, it's you can't see it. I was supposed basically to make it bigger, so it would be more recognizable. I want to argue that a Jewish kid, in the family to which the Haggadah belonged at a certain point in time, added mustache once he understood that the Bechorot were not necessarily kids. So he was confused because where he lived, which is the Ottoman Empire, grown-up men have mustache. So probably, I would imagine, he would ask his father, what are these babies here? And the father would say, well, these are not babies, these are the firstborn, right? And then the kid add the mustache, and you can see that they are different, and they are all black, and they make them males, like the firstborn men. Okay, now here you can see, and it's beautiful because this is 13th, 14th century, and it looks totally postmodern. This is Kriyat Yam Suf. So you can see how Jews are going through the sea, and how the Egyptians, including the king, right, are taken by the sea. And the painting looks a bit like Chagall, right? But it's only 500 years before Chagall. So now the third brand would be the Olympic Games in Sarajevo, and now we are getting to the main Sarajevo mosque, which you will be seeing once you get to Sarajevo. So basically, here we need to say a few things. When Jews were expelled from Spain, right? The overwhelming majority of them went to the Ottoman Empire. Now, which instrument of transportation you would imagine they were using? Ship, right? So, that means that they were coming from one port city to another port city. So obviously, in the Ottoman Empire, the first generation would not come yet to the mainland. They were coming to the main ports, like Istanbul, Constantinopolis, like Salonika, right? Okay. So the Ottoman Empire on one side was much more tolerant than Catholic Christian Europe, right? On the other side, some people on the left of the political map in the last 100 years tend to exaggerate the level of Ottoman tolerance. So we need to put everything into context and perspective. Yes, everything is relative. So the Ottoman Empire was much more tolerant than the Catholic Europe, but on the other side, its tolerance is not comparable to our modern standards. And basically, that's why I brought this picture. You can see here how magnificent the main mosque looks like, right? And right next to it you have a watchtower, and all of this is very huge. And then you will see, this is the old temple, this is the old synagogue of Sarajevo, and this is, I will switch, this is the old Serbian Orthodox Church. So what can you tell about these two buildings? You will be seeing all of this in vivo, right? You will be seeing all these buildings once you get there. But I'm now making for you a small introduction. So what's in common for these two buildings, right? This is the Serbian Orthodox Church, and this is the Serbian Orthodox Church, and this is the old synagogue. So what's similar between these two compared to that one? Yes?
This one seems to have a dome, while the others seem to have angular roof.
This one is imperial, magnificent, huge, right? You could call it cathedralic, right? It's a huge, it dominates the city. On the other side, the Jewish and the Christian places of worship were not supposed to be recognizable as such from the outside. So you can see, for example, that in the Serbian Orthodox Church, you can see that the tower was added later. So basically, both buildings looked like a big storage house. They didn't look like a major place of worship. And why is this? Because the concept of Islamic city shows the full and definitive domination of Islam. And then, under the Omar's Pact, have you ever heard of Omar's Pact? Have you ever heard of Omar's Pact? No. Okay, so if I'm to put this into modern English, Islam imagined Judaism to be DOS and Christianity to be Windows 3.16. You are too young to remember those operating systems. Basically, Islam believed itself to be Windows 7. And it believed Christianity to be Windows 3.16, you know, with icons. And it believed Judaism to be DOS. Now, why is this important? Because according to the Pact of Omar, which was the third caliph of the Islamic Caliphate, Jews and Christians were not supposed to build new buildings in the Islamic Empire. Why? Islam would say something like this: the firm Divine Software did publish out Judaism. The firm Divine Software did publish a program called Christianity. Now, so these programs are genuine. God really gave them. But now God came up with a better program called Windows 7. Now, can you imagine calling Microsoft and saying, I have a major problem with my operating system? And the guy there says which operating system you are running, and you say Windows 3.16. And he says, there is no more support for that. And you say, but I bought it from you. And he says, yeah, no, of course you did. It's a genuine problem. It's just that we are not giving any more support for it. So what's the idea? The idea was Islam believes that Judaism and Christianity were given by God, but it also believes that God himself gave a better program now. So that means that you cannot use force to forcefully remove previous genuine divine programs, but you are not giving support for them anymore. In other words, according to Omar's Pact, Jews and Christians were supposed to die out slowly but surely. Consequently, any Islamic empire, including the Ottoman Empire, was not supposed to allow building of new mosques, building of new churches and building of new synagogues. The idea was, since they are dying out slowly, they are allowed to have their own existent synagogues and churches. Once those die out and they die out, Islam will rule all over the world. Now, obviously, when Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, and when they came to Sarajevo, there was no previous synagogue in Sarajevo. So Jews were, Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks, were basically a very practical and pragmatical people. On one side, their own Islamic rule would not allow them to allow the Jews build new synagogues, because you can only keep running the old ones. You are not even supposed to enlarge the old ones. But what you can do is, you can bribe the authorities to lie to themselves, right? You can bribe the, listen very carefully. This is something that you as Americans are not necessarily exposed to too much, but that's part of the magic of the Middle East. So, you are basically, if the synagogue costs $1 million, to build a new synagogue in Ottoman Empire, it costs $2 million. Why? Because $1 million you need to invest into the synagogue, and another $1 million you need to bribe all the instances. First of all, the local judges, then the provincial judges, and then the Sultan himself. So you would give, let's imagine, you would give $200,000 to the local judge, and then you would give $300,000 to the provincial judge, and then you would give $500,000 to the sultan. And why is all of this? Because all these people know that you know that they know that you are lying when you are saying that you are repairing an old and existing synagogue. And in order to make it easier for them to give you the authorization for something that's an obvious lie, you need to bribe them. So, even though there was a very, as you can see, this is not what we call tolerance, right? Today, what's tolerance today? You buy a piece of land and you build a synagogue, any hate you want, and right? That's the way it goes in America. There are authorities which need to authorize you according to the urbanistic plan and so on. But they will never tell you, oh, you cannot build such a huge synagogue because it will be bigger than the church. You can. Okay. Now in the Ottoman Empire, yes please.
Did the Jews want to build synagogues to like create facts on the ground in order to prove that they were there, or did they want them solely for a place of worship?
They wanted them solely as a place of worship. So you can see that basically, even when synagogues were allowed, they were supposed to be camouflaged, whatever is the English word, from the outside. So from the outside, they shouldn't look extremely magnificent. So you will see something very interesting. You see, this is the old synagogue from the outside. It's not a magnificent building. But then when you enter inside, and this is the old Serbian church, which looks even more modest from the outside. But then this is the synagogue, the same synagogue, when you enter on the inside. So this is something that's basically very hard to copy. How to achieve magnificence on the inside and modesty on the outside. The building on the outside is modest, and once you enter it on the inside, it looks huge, and it has 3 floors, right? So you can see that the third floor was Azarat Nashim, that's where ladies prayed, and second and the first floor were for males. Now, this is the way it looks today, and today this is serving as a museum of Sarajevo Jews, and once a year this museum converts back to synagogue. On Erev Rosh Hashanah each year there is a service held there. Now, unlike Catholic Europe, there was no ghetto in the Ottoman Empire. Jews, they lived all over the city, not necessarily in Jewish streets or Jewish areas. Unlike Russia and Ukraine, unlike the Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews are totally urban. There is no Sephardic shtetl. There is no Sephardic Jewish village. Okay? So, unlike Central Europe, which was Catholic, and where Jews lived in ghettos, Jews in the Ottoman Empire lived dispersed throughout the city. Unlike Russia and Ukraine, unlike Eastern Europe, where Jews had Jewish villages, the entire Sephardic population of the Ottoman Empire was totally and unequivocally urban. So there were no Jewish villages. So, this is the Jewish cemetery of Sarajevo. You will see it once you get there. It's very famous for very unusual gravestones. These gravestones remind basically a sitting lion. That's at least what historians of art are saying. And then they would imagine there is one mentioning of the word Sepharad in the Bible. Where is that? Who do you know? Sepharad is mentioned in the Bible. In the book of Prophet Obadiah, it says Galut Yerushalayim Asher Bisparad, or the diaspora of Jerusalem which sits in Sepharad, right, will inherit the cities of Negev. In Jewish tradition, this came to mean Spain. So already in the Aramaic translation of that particular verse in Obadiah, it says Hispania. Hispania meaning Spain. Now, it seems the science, modern science would say that the original Sepharad was not Spain, right? anyhow, in Jewish tradition, this came to mean Spain. And then Jews of Spain were priding themselves, or were taking a tremendous pride in the fact that they were described in the Bible as diaspora of Jerusalem, the aristocracy, the king family, the aristocracy, the priestly families. So, what's the sign of Judah? A lion. So that's why some people would imagine the Jews of Sarajevo as descendants of the Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain and who were descendants of the aristocracy and priesthood of Jerusalem, that they would have a sitting lion as their gravestone. So over there you will see.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
A what-if question. We've been to Saloniki, and until the Ottomans left, it was an Ottoman city. It had the largest Jewish graveyard in Europe, maybe in the world at the time. And we know that after the population transfers and all, and the demise of the Ottoman Empire, you have in World War II, that cemetery was plowed over. Within 2 weeks, nothing was left other than whatever. Why was this cemetery spared that? And was it? I just would be interested in your thought. I don't know if there's any research, but the nature of the people who lived there. There was.
Well, the Jewish cemetery in Salonika was huge, and it was in what was becoming the center of the new city. So, but it's more complicated than that. For centuries, Ottoman Salonika was basically a Jewish republic. They used to say, even angels in Salonika speak Judeo-Spanish. I'll tell you a few stories about that. Then Salonika became Greek, even though Greeks were not even 20% of the population. So the state was trying to Hellenize Salonika on all, in any imaginable way. And then huge Jewish cemetery in the city center was just proving how non-Hellenic and how Jewish Salonika was. So later, when Germans came, they made the Jews help destroying their own cemetery, destroying their own history, and then some of the stones were used to make the officer club for German soldiers and the piscine, right, the swimming pool, and so on. Now in Sarajevo, Jewish cemetery was on the hill, so it wasn't bothering anyone. So it wasn't huge, it wasn't in the city center, there was no state who was trying to get over with this cemetery even before the Second World War, like the Greek state was. Okay, so you will see, for example, today in Israel, people are fighting with Hebra Kadisha, whether you can put a picture on the stone, right? But in Sarajevo, this was a very old custom. Since the beginning of the photography, Jews used to put pictures on their graveyards.
Is that just Sarajevo or all?
All Sephardic world. In Salonika also, in Turkey also, totally typical for Sephardim. Now you can see that some of the gravestones, right, have inscriptions in German, because there was Ashkenazi population coming to the city mostly after 1878, the Berlin Congress, when Bosnia stopped being the most northern Ottoman province, and all of a sudden it became the most southern province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Until that moment, the community was predominantly Sephardic. With the Austro-Hungarian occupation, Ashkenazim start coming in bigger numbers. And then, when you enter the cemetery, you will see on the left side you have a small Ashkenazi cemetery, and then on the right side and up to the hill, all the way up to the hill, it's all Sephardic cemetery. So you can see that during the last civil war, many of the stones were damaged. This is the way it looked like by the end of 19th century. Okay, now these are Bosnian medieval gravestones, non-Jewish. They were typical of all three Christian denominations in Bosnia, Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, and Bosnian Protestant Christians. And you can see basically that, you can see especially from these like small stones on the side, this you will see in the National Museum, all of these, you can see that probably the medieval Bosnian gravestones influenced the Bosnian Jewish gravestones, and that's the way to explain how those specific gravestones of Sarajevo came to existence. Now I will say a few words about the rabbinic authorities. So basically, when Jews were expelled from Spain, as I said, they came to Istanbul, they came to Salonika. From Salonika, they were coming to Sarajevo as merchants. But these were errant, so-called errant merchants. In other words, merchants who don't live in Sarajevo, but they come twice a year. So how would that work like? They would go back to Salonika for high holidays. So they would spend September and October in Salonika. Then they would bring, in December, they would bring the what we would call winter products. They would bring them to Sarajevo. They would be selling them for whatever, a month or two. Then, with the money they got, they would buy spring products from Sarajevo, bring them down to Salonika, spend Pesach in Salonika, okay, and then again buy new stuff to sell it in Sarajevo. At one point, the Turkish authorities told them, guys, this is not working. Jews are very important for local economy. Every time you come in, it goes up. Every time you go out, it goes down. So either stay, either go away. But we are not interested in having you coming and living. This is not good for the economy. So the first Jews were basically made stay in Sarajevo. Very soon, they acquired a place for a graveyard, because think logically. What's the first thing that you need in a Jewish community? When you are establishing a Jewish community, what's the first thing you need? Is the synagogue? Cemetery and mikveh, okay? Because ladies need to take tevilah, right? And that's from the day one. And then very soon somebody dies. So these are the first two institutions you have. Then the third institution is a school. And synagogue is only the fourth. Not necessarily the last one, but the fourth, because you can pray before that in any single house. Okay. So, Jews were made stay in Sarajevo. They were staying in a han. Do you know what's a han? It's like inn, a very Ottoman thing. Being the fact that they started as merchants who were coming in the city and staying in the city in a hotel, this hotel became the nucleus of the future Jewish community. Because once they were made stay, they stayed there. And they actually acquired the building, and this was where they had the first synagogue, and then later that building was destroyed and they really built a big synagogue that's called the Old Synagogue of Sarajevo. Now, something about the rabbis. During the first 2 centuries, Sarajevo was importing rabbis. Now, what does that mean, importing rabbis? Every time a rabbi would feel that his expertise is too big for such a small community, he would leave for a better place. And Sarajevo would stay without a rabbi. And then they would turn again to yeshiva in Salonika, and then the yeshiva in Salonika would send them a new rabbi, that's somebody that just yesterday finished his school. And then this rabbi would work there for 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, until he makes a bit of name. As soon as he has some name and fame, he goes someplace else to a better place. So on this picture you can see Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi, or Rabbi Tzvi, he was Ashkenazi rabbi who left the Austro-Hungarian Empire, went to Salonika, studied in Salonika, and then on his way back, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he was going through Sarajevo, and the community asked him to stay there and lead it as a rabbi. And he did for some time, but later he was offered a better place in Amsterdam. So he went to Amsterdam, and then there was a huge disputation between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic rabbis in Amsterdam. Chacham David Nieto, who was the chief rabbi of the Sephardic community, said that God and nature are one and the same thing. Why? Because the nature, HaTeva, and Elohim in Hebrew have the same numerical value. The chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Amsterdam said that this was a heresy, right? So the guy told him that maybe according to your tradition, not according to our tradition. So the only authority that could judge between the two was Chacham Tzvi, because he was both. He was born as Ashkenazi, but he was brought up as Sephardic. And then, as you can see, by the end of 18th century, a famous rabbi, David Pardo, comes to Sarajevo. He establishes over there a yeshiva. And then, all of a sudden, Sarajevo becomes a very important Jewish center. This guy has 3 sons. Each of them becomes a rabbi in a different city around Sarajevo. And he has 3 other pupils, and each of them becomes rabbi on other places. And then these rabbis are producing new rabbis. And then all these new rabbis are turning back to Sarajevo Yeshiva for guidance. And this is the way Sarajevo becomes a major center of Jewish learning. Now over here, how many of you have been to Yafa? I suppose everybody. Have you seen the street called Rabbi Yehuda Marguza? In Yafa, in the old city. Well, that's a beautiful story, because the guy, everything about that is wrong. First of all, it's not Marguza, it's Me Raguza. But the way they spell it in Hebrew, Mem Resh Gimel Vav Zayin He, right? That made everybody think that it's Marguza, that it's one word, that it's second name. But it's not Marguza, it's Me Raguza, meaning from Dubrovnik. Raguza is the city on the Croatian coast, right? Today it's called Dubrovnik. Once upon a time it was called Raguza. Now this guy, again, Rabbi Yehuda Marguza. Well, at least now we know it's not Marguza, it's Meraguza. But there is another problem. He was not actually from Dubrovnik. When he came to Yafa, and he was one of the first Zionist leaders to start, you know, with the orchards and that kind of agriculture. Can you imagine? Rabbi who works and who inspires others to work in agriculture and so on. So when he only came to Yafa, they asked him, where did he come from?
What year was that?
End of 19th, you can see.
Oh, okay.
Okay, from 1840. So when he only came to Yafa, they asked him, where do you come from? So he imagined that they were asking him from each port he took the ship. So he told them from Raguza. But he's not from Raguza, he was in Raguza for a week, waiting for a boat, right? Okay, so that's the picture, and you can see basically how Ottoman his look is. Why? Because Sarajevo, which today is in southeastern Europe, was part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so here you can see some of the works of the famous rabbis, and here is the Sarajevo-born father of modern Zionism, Rabbi Yehuda ben Shlomo Hai Alkalai. There is not a single street, there is not a single city in Israel which doesn't have a street with his name. Now, why? Well, this guy, together with Rabbi Yehuda Bivas and together with Rabbi Kalisher, these were the founding fathers of Zionism. Now, let me put it this way, and I'm not trying to argue with anyone, but you know how it works. In official history, there are always many things which are said, not necessarily because that's the way the things were, but because that's the way we would like them to be. So when the story of Herzl, when the narrative about Herzl was created, it was created by the second Aliyah. These people were mostly secular, many of them anti-religious, right? So they imagined Herzl in their own likeness and image. So what they used to tell you about Herzl? He's coming from an assimilated Jewish family, right? And then during the Dreyfus affair, he discovers that there is no other solution for the Jews but Jewish national state. Then for some time he's flirting with the idea of Uganda, and then finally there is a huge decision of Jewish state in Palestine. Well, there is a problem. First of all, Herzl is not the father of modern Zionism. He's the second and third generation of Zionists. What the second Aliyah people didn't like was that the fathers of Zionism were all rabbis. Two of them Sephardic and one of them Ashkenazi. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Chai Alkalai was a prophetic Kabbalist. What does that mean, prophetic Kabbalist? He used Kabbalah to prophesize about the redemption of the Jewish people. But this would make him, this would not make him yet political Zionist. The thing was that not only he was proclaiming the redemption in the name of God, but he was also establishing a society which was supposed to buy lands in the land of Israel and then to give them to young couples, not to old people to come and pray at the Western Wall, but to young couples to come and work in Israel and have children. So that's political Zionism, and this is the father, one of the three founding fathers of political Zionism. Today they call him Heartbringer, but he's not the Heartbringer. He is the father. Herzl is the son of Zionism, not the father of Zionism. Now, just to finish the sentence. The guy was born in Sarajevo. He was serving as a rabbi in Zemun, which today is part of Belgrade. And he also wrote a grammar of modern Hebrew in Judeo-Spanish, because that was the language of the Jews of the Ottoman Empire. And he was basically trying to convert Hebrew into a living language. So he's writing a grammar of it, not in order to help you learn the Bible, but in order to help you learn the language as a living language. Yes, sorry.
I was just going to say that Arthur Hertzberg, who wrote the book The Zionist Idea, has him down under the chapter Proto-Zionists.
Well, I would start the counting differently. This is the Zionists. And then there is the second and the third generation. Now, why am I underlining this? Because one of his ardent followers was Herzl's father. Herzl's grandfather. Can you imagine? Herzl's grandfather was a shamash in the synagogue led by this rabbi. So Herzl's grandfather was already a Zionist. Herzl's grandfather was already an ardent Zionist who was paying a Zionist shekel. Zionist shekel is amount of money that you were giving on yearly basis in order for this society established by Rabbi Alkalai to acquire lands in the land of Israel, right? So that's not something that I see as proto-Zionism or whatever, religious, philosophical and so on. This is very practical. This is very political, right? And he was traveling all over Europe, and he was trying to reach out to as many influential European Jews as possible, and he was very successful. And then Herzl basically inherited Zionism in his own home. He was never the assimilated Jew they wanted you to believe. Okay? Yes?
Apropos language, Hebrew language, there is the Alkalai dictionary, Hebrew dictionary.
Oh, that's not his. That's another. That's Aryeh Alkalai.
That's Aryeh Alkalai?
Yes,
okay.
That's another Alkalai.
The other one is, there is a book published recently by an Israeli doctor, actually, who suggests that Herzl actually has some religious, not only upbringing, but some more than just...
Well, right now they are discovering more and more facts. Now the family is from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Some very good friends of mine are cousins of Herzl. Now Herzls are not Herzls, they were labels. There was a numerus clausus. There was a certain number of Jews that were allowed to live in the city of Zemun, where that family lived, right? So the Herzl guy, he had a permission to live there, and he had a daughter. Label guy had two sons. So one of the label guys got married with Herzl's daughter and took her name. Now these labels are coming from two Catholic priests. Can you imagine that? Two Catholic priests who were anusim in Spain. In other words, those Jews who didn't leave Spain in 1492. They converted to Catholicism. They stayed there. The original name of the family was Amar. Later, it was just like the chief rabbi of Israel today, Amar. It was made into Spanish Amor. Amor meaning love. Then some of these people, two of the members of this family became Catholic priests because many Jews knew that Inquisition was after them. So they were trying to save themselves from the Inquisition by going as deep, penetrating as deep into the Catholic Church as possible in order not to be looked for. Now, two of them escaped and they came to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then people asked them, are you sure you were Jewish? And they said, yes. So what's your name? Amor. So this was translated into Yiddish as Lebel. And then from Lebel, you have Herzl. So this is a huge story, and it's very different than what's usually taught. Now here, I want to show you something. I want to tell you a very beautiful story because at the moment in the time that we live in, it's very important to know that Jews and Muslims can live in a different way, not necessarily the way we fight today. Why I'm underlining this? The Jews of Sarajevo have a special holiday. It's called Purim de Sarai, the Sarajevo Purim. And the thing that happened was like this. There was a Jewish guy called Moshe Haviro. This Moshe Haviro converted to Islam. This was not something typical for Sephardic Jews. On very few occasions, few people converted to Islam. Until Shabtai Tzvi and that major turmoil. So, this guy converts to Islam, and he becomes Dervish Ahmed. He goes around, and he tells all the Muslims, especially uneducated Muslims, that the reason why the Ottoman Empire is losing its power against the Christian Europe is that they are undermining the Omar's Pact, under which they should basically put down the Jews and the Christians. So basically you have a Jew who converted to Islam, who is explaining the Muslims that they are punished by God for being too good to the Jews and to the Christians. Now, Ottoman Empire was an Islamic empire, meaning that everything religious was political, everything political was religious. So the central power could not allow such a man to interpret Islam on his own. So he was executed by the Turkish Ottoman authorities. Later, the new Wazir, the new head of the province, comes to Bosnia, and dervish around this Dervish Ahmed tell him, you see, the Jews have their intrigues, and so big are their intrigues that one single person who converted from Judaism to Islam, they managed to kill him. So now this Wazir, he was not too interested in Islam or Judaism, but he loved money. So he looked at the small Jewish community of Travnik. He understood there was not enough money for him over there. So he goes to the capital of the province, to Sarajevo, and he takes prisoners Rabbi Moshe Danon and 9 other dignitaries of Jewish community. He takes them to prison, and he says, if until Shabbat at noon you don't deliver this amount of money, they will all be executed. Now the entire Jewish, the amount of money he was asking for meant that the entire Jewish community would bankrupt. They needed basically to give all money they had. At that moment there were 8 alcoholic bars in Sarajevo. Why I'm underlining alcoholic bars? Because under Islam, Muslims are not supposed to drink. But not supposed and what they really do are 2 different things. So there were 8 alcoholic bars. It was known the Jews would not go to now try to follow me because we are not speaking Western culture here. So it's Eastern, it was the Ottoman Empire, it's Eastern culture, so there are nuances. So follow this. Usually Jews would not go to Muslim alcoholic bars. If they would, they wouldn't go on Shabbat. But if they would go on Shabbat, they wouldn't go on Shabbat Eve, rather on Shabbat morning. And if they would go on Shabbat morning, they usually would not pay immediately, but after Shabbat. And usually they would not ask for something that's prepared with fire, right? Because that would be a violation of Jewish law. But rather they would ask for something alcoholic. Now, it's Shabbat Eve, and one of the rabbis, called Chaim Halevi, goes from one alcoholic bar to another. He enters, he sits down, and he asks for coffee. Now all the Muslims in the bar are confused. You are a rabbi. You're not supposed to be here. And certainly you are not supposed to be here on Erev Shabbat. And even if you are here on Erev Shabbat, you are supposed to ask for arak. You're not supposed to ask for coffee. And then he also plays on anti-Semitic prejudices, which are Jews are stinky, right? They don't give money too easily. So the guy comes and brings him coffee. He puts a golden coin and leaves without drinking his coffee. Oh, that's huge, you know. So he goes from one to another. He passes through all 8 of them. And then he goes home. Once he gets to his home, all the dignitaries of the city are in front of his house. And they tell him, we know you want to say something. We know you are trying to say something. What do you want? And he says, well, listen to me. If these guys are wrong, let them be executed. And if they are right, let them be freed. But what kind of guilt is that can be rectified with the ransom money? Don't imagine that this Wazir will stop with Jewish dignitaries and Jewish money. Today he will take our dignitaries and our money. Tomorrow it will be Christian dignitaries and Christian money. But once he spent our money and Christian money, he will get to your money and to your dignitaries. So it's up to you whether you can bear this huge injustice. Now tomorrow morning, without internet, without TV, without radio, without newspapers, not a single store was open in the market. How people in the Middle East know when to open and when not, that's one of the major secrets of the Middle East. However though, people knew, people felt that something is going on. So the dignitaries of the Sarajevo community, the dignitaries of Muslim Sarajevo community go to the Wazir to ask for the liberation of the Jewish captives. Now they came with all their weapons on their horses. Wazir, as soon as he saw them approaching his palace, he clothed himself as a woman and he escaped. Right? So these people came and they freed the Jews. Okay, now there is, I hope you can follow, it's a bit complicated, but Jews in Sarajevo were so secure about themselves that later narrative of this was not comfortable with presenting the thing as salvation of the Jews by the Muslims. Why? Because in that case, Jews would be the object of history and not the subject of history. Now, when we are speaking of a tiny community, when you are speaking of a recent community, when you are speaking of a community which doesn't have huge roots, that's possible. But when you are speaking of such a community as Sarajevo community, people were like, no, we don't feel like being object of history. When do we when do we commemorate the day of Holocaust in Israel? The day of uprisal in Warsaw Ghetto. The same logic. We don't want to remember the Holocaust on the day when the Auschwitz was freed by somebody else, because that would make us object of history and not subject of history. We want to take part in our history. So we say, we don't remember the Holocaust on 27th of January when the rest of the world remembers it. We remember the Holocaust on the day of uprisal in Warsaw Ghetto. So the same way, the Sarajevo Jews have this book called Zichron Moshe. And this book tells the story in a totally different way. According to Ramban Nachmanides, a medieval rabbi from the same place from where the Sarajevo Haggadah is, from Barcelona, he said once upon a time that everything, entire future of every single individual Jew and of entire Jewish nation is written in Parashat Ha'azinu. Parashat Ha'azinu is one of the last chapters of the 5th book of Moses of Devarim, right? So Ramban says, if you know how to read this chapter, you actually know the entire Jewish history from before. So now the Jews telling the same story, they tell it like this. When Rushdie Pasha, the new Turkish governor, came to Sarajevo, before that, it was Parashat Ha'azinu, it was Shabbat Ha'azinu. And the Rabbi Moshe Danon said, Ya'arov, right, there is a pasuk over there, there is a verse over there which says, Ya'arov Ketal, and so on. So he said, Ya'arov means, Rashi Tevot, acronym, abbreviation, Ya'amod Aleinu Rushdie Pasha. In other words, Rushdie Pasha will stand against us. That's, in other words, the Jews are saying that Rabbi knew beforehand that this calamity is coming to the community. And then the other Jewish addition to the story, the story is shared story. Jews intervene in the story only twice, at the beginning and at the end. At the end, when the Muslims are coming to liberate the Jews, the rabbi looks at the watch and he says, "Oh, you Bosnians, you just needed to be late, didn't you?" So the people say to him like, "What?" And he's like, "Well, there is a verse in the Bible which says that God will that God will save you in any single moment. And then if you translate that every single moment to numbers, you get this year, this month, this day, this hour, and you were late." So basically, the rabbi knew beforehand about the coming calamity, and the rabbi knew that they were supposed to be liberated, so the rabbi took it at easy. Now, I'm bringing to an end the morning story, the first lecture. But this guy that you see over here, it's Zeki Efendi. He is one of the last Sarajevo Jews to be schooled the old Ottoman way. He was fluent in Turkish, Arabic, Persian. You can see that he was wearing Ottoman garbs and so on. And he was also the first Jew, Bosnian Jew, to acquire Western education. He was schooled at the West also. So this rabbi that was miraculously saved and that knew miraculously that the calamity was coming and when it will end, at the end he was called Moshe Danon. At the end of his days, Rabbi Moshe Danon, here you can see his grave. This is the grave of Rabbi Moshe Danon, and it's in Stolac near Mostar. The rabbi was rabbi in Sarajevo. He decides to leave for the land of Israel. Now you have to imagine, for Ashkenazim, coming to the land of Israel was something huge, quite abnormal. Not too many people were able to do it. For Sephardim, coming to the land of Israel was a normal thing. Many people came here just to spend their last years because it was all one empire, right? So Jews, can you imagine, Sarajevo and Belgrade and Sofia and Salonika and Istanbul and Beersheba and Jerusalem and Hebron were all in the same country. So Jews were coming from Sarajevo here the same way Jews are coming in America to Florida or to California because it's a mild climb and it's a better place to live. Now this guy decides he goes to the land of Israel. On the way he's going on his horse, and on the way near Stolac a tree, he passes under a tree and the tree removes his head. He was a Kabbalist. He says this is a sign, a divine sign that he is just about to die. So he gets off his horse, he sits down and he reads Zohar until he dies. And then he was buried there. And then his place became the place of pilgrimage for Bosnian Jews. So until this very day, Jews go once a year to the place of Rabbi Moshe Danon. And now we go to this guy, Moshe Ben Raphael Atias, called Zeki Effendi. He still had the Ottoman education, but he also already acquired Western education. So he had a major health problem. He goes to Vienna, and the doctors tell him that as soon as tomorrow morning he needs to pass a major chirurgical operation. He goes back to his hotel and he goes to sleep, and in his dream miraculous Rabbi Moshe Danon shows up in his dream, and he tells him, just go home, it's all taken care of. Now, he was old-timer, so he goes home. So his sons tell him, are you crazy? You were supposed to undergo the operation. He says, Rabbi came to me in my dream, he told me it's all taken care of, so it's taken care of. He really lived for additional 20 years, and as a sign of respect to this rabbi, he wrote the famous Sarajevo Megillah, being the fact that the day when the Jews were freed by the Muslims from the prison is called the Purim of Sarajevo. Then, the same way on normal Purim, you read Megillah. This guy wrote the Megillah for the Jews of Sarajevo. And that Megillah is telling the story of liberation of the Jewish community by the local Muslims. Now you can see here, this is already the next generation of rabbis. This is already the period of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you can see that this guy is missing something. Missing what? A kippah, right, because Sephardim never had a kippah. Either they had something like this, or they had turbans like this, right? Or they had nothing. There is not a word for kippah in Sephardic. You don't have a Judeo-Spanish word for that, because it never existed. Okay, now this is the synagogue, which is right next to that museum, to the old synagogue. It's called New Synagogue, but it's also called the Synagogue of the Mutes. Now, why the Synagogue of the Mutes? Because this rabbi was running the synagogue, and he was more modernistic rabbi, so he had a choir in the synagogue. And then, entering that synagogue, you know you have Lincoln Square synagogue, right? And people called it Wink and Stare synagogue, right? Because unmarried people go there to see each other and so on. So, this is what this synagogue was serving for in Sarajevo. It was fancy schmancy. There was a choir singing. Old timers used to call the synagogue of the mutes. Why? Because you were supposed to shut up. You were not supposed to pray in the synagogue because you don't know how to do it in a way that it will sound like an opera. So there was a professional chazan, and there was a professional choir, and everybody else could just socially mingle. So the synagogue was called the Synagogue of the Mutes, and you can see how two synagogues are right next to each other. So this is another Sarajevo rabbi. Again, you can see from the Turkish period. So he has all of them have these Turkish hats, right? This is the last synagogue. Yes, this is the last synagogue that you will see in this presentation, and you will also see it in Sarajevo when you get there. Okay, I will show you just one more thing, and we are done. This is the Ashkenazi synagogue, which today serves as the only daily and Shabbat synagogue. There are no anymore separate Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities. The Jewish communities, too, after the Holocaust, very few Jews survived. Those that survived have one single community. So this is the community in which we have prayers now.
That's where we're dominant from.
Yes, yes. And then once upon a time, this was a huge building, as you can see. After the war, they needed more space for non-religious activities. So they split the synagogue into two. The upper floor stayed synagogue, and the lower floor became the Jewish community center, right? So these are some of the intellectuals, and this is the great synagogue, which still exists in the city, and you will see it, but it doesn't belong anymore to the Jewish community, right? This was built in the pseudo-Maorish style, and Jews finished it in the 30s, right before the Second World War. So you can see this is the era of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. At that period, every fifth person in the city was Jewish. Jews felt so secure that they wanted a synagogue which is even higher than the Muslim mosque, right? And then only a few years later, Hitler came, and everybody knows what happens. So thank you so much, and
We'll continue 10 minutes. 10 minutes break. Who are you named after?
well,
Famous Rabbi
yes,
Eliezer Papo?
yes, but they are. Let me
Are you related to him?
just a moment. Okay.